Even though most of the reformers agreed on a lot of the big issues of the Reformation, there remained differences among the various factions. They had all thrown off the Pope and basically agreed the scriptures were a sufficient authority, and they agreed sinful humans were justified by faith in the crucified Christ. Still, as they dusted off those Bibles covered in a few centuries of dust, they came to some pretty different theological conclusions that continue to separate, for example, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Methodists, and Baptists to this very day. To conclude our season on the Reformers, we're having a friendly dialogue between a Calvinist and a Methodist on issues covered in earlier episodes on whether perfection is possible. Thanks again for listening. I'm Evan McClanahan. I'm the pastor here at First Lutheran. I'm joined by Sarah Stone from Memorial Drive Presbyterian Church.
Hey, guys.
And as always, check out HoustonTOT.com to stay in touch with what we're up to, our events, podcasts, and all of that. Certainly subscribe to this. Tell your friends about it. We're creating more seasonal content, more researched content for our dear listeners so that they can walk away from this whole season with a lot more knowledge about what really went on in the Reformation, what the issues really at stake were, and just trying to understand history better and how we ended up where we are and why we believe what we believe. But to try to wrap up some of the main ideas of the Reformation and highlight some of the main differences between really two of the largest traditions to emerge from the Reformation, I'd say the two largest historically in America for sure, we wanted to have this little debate. And so joining us is our guest from our episode on Calvinism, or John Calvin, Pastor Aaron Wright from Grace Family Baptist Church. He'll argue more or less that when Calvinists say total depravity, they really mean it. And a special guest, past panel member of a Theology on Tap event, Bishop Scott Jones, the Bishop of the Texas Annual Conference, who, fortunately for us, offices right here in Houston. He'll speak to a topic that we did address in our episode with Pastor Meredith Mills on John Wesley, the idea that a Christian can, through the spiritual work of sanctification, become perfect. So thank you guys both for joining us. I had minimal bios. Dr. Jones, why don't you kind of go first? Tell us a little bit about how you ended up where you are in this illustrious bishop seat and other bishoprics, I guess you served, and you're a professor at SMU for a while. Just give the audience a little flavor for your background here.
Well, Evan, thank you for inviting me, and I'm glad to be in this conversation with all of you. I'm a fourth-generation Methodist and United Methodist preacher. I came to SMU where I did master's and Ph.D. work. I was a pastor for 11 years, then a full-time professor at Perkins School of Theology, SMU, for 7 years. Then they elected me bishop, sent me to Kansas for 12 years, then to Houston, where I've been serving for 6 years. I've written books on United Methodist doctrine, on John Wesley's conception and use of Scripture, on the evangelistic love of God and neighbor. So I've been a bishop and away from academia full-time for the last 18 years, but I'm retiring in 3 months, and we'll see what God has in store for me in the future, Evan.
A lot of podcast episodes, I'm sure. I love all this free time. And Aaron.
Yeah, my name's Aaron Wright. I am one of the pastors at Grace Family Baptist Church in Houston, Texas. We're right at I-45 in 1960. I attended Level College at the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary in New Orleans. I graduated with a bachelor's degree in Christian ministry. I've been serving as an elder at Grace Family Baptist Church since 2015. I came on full-time in 2019. I have a lovely wife, Janice, and 5 children that we've been blessed with.
Good deal. Well, glad you're both here. So let's just kind of jump in. So John Wesley, as we heard, he was a fiery preacher. Things like the altar call, Meredith said, were kind of the result of his preaching, the idea that the Christian needed to not just have a formal relationship to the church, but a personal relationship to Jesus Christ. His own heart was strangely warmed. I believe listening to Luther's or reading Luther's commentary on the Romans. So basically, we get all the credit for all this. But yeah, so and he really preached amendment of life and pursuit of holiness in the life of the Christian. And I don't know, did that mean that we can end up perfect? What does that kind of doctrine mean? But maybe if you want to give a little background getting us to that point with Wesley, feel free to do that too.
Well, John Wesley was a priest of the Church of England, and he was again the son of another priest of the Church of England, a grandson of dissenters, actually. But when he went to Oxford, he encountered Bishop Jeremy Taylor's tradition of holy living and holy dying. That helped him come to a deeper awareness of holiness. Then he has this spiritual crisis where he realizes, oh my gosh, I can't achieve what God has commanded me to achieve. I can't be as holy as I need to be. Then he runs into Moravians. They were some of the people who helped convey the Reformation to him. And he then opened up the doctrinal statements of the Church of England and reread them and realized, no, I'm saved by grace alone. That led Wesley on a spiritual journey personally, that he then had his heartwarming experience at Aldersgate Street, but also developing his theology into what I have characterized as the extreme center. Wesley holds in tension both justification by faith and sanctification by faith. And he has strong things to say about how right Luther was on justification and how right the Catholics are about sanctification. So that was his theological journey. And if there was a text that sort of helps realize how the New Testament itself occupies the extreme center, I'd point to Ephesians 2, 8 through 10, where it says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing." Hence the Lutheran emphasis of, you can't earn your salvation. It's the gift of God, not the result of works, so that no one may boast. But then verse 10, "For we are what he has made us, created in Christ Jesus for good works." Hence, you've got to say, we're not saved by good works, but we're created for good works. Wesley justified this by interpreting Scripture in a particular way. He said, every commandment in Scripture is a covered or hidden promise. The proof text for this is Matthew 5:48, where the text is pretty clear in saying, you must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Well, that was a key thing for Wesley, saying perfection is expected, it's possible. But Wesley knew his Greek well enough to know that the verb in this text could either be interpreted as the present imperative, as it's normally translated, you must be perfect, or be perfect. It's also in the Greek possible to read it as the future indicative, you will be perfect. And he regards that commandment as simultaneously a promise. So he thinks the law and the gospel are two sides of the same coin, and that the promise that you will be able to fulfill the law is out there.
It's good stuff.
Yeah. Let's park on a couple of terms real fast, and just justification, sanctification, and maybe kind of define those a little bit and talk about, I'm not going to take away, I promise I'll give you all your time, but I think for the audience, maybe give a definition of each one of those words.
Well, Wesley understands discipleship as the way of salvation, the way to the kingdom. This is God's expectation, so that being converted, becoming a Christian, is just the beginning of a lifetime's journey of salvation. Justification he describes as a relative change. It's a change in relationship, and so that the sinner is justified by faith alone and becomes accepted of God, reconciled to God, welcomed into the family of Christ, and saved in that sense. At the same time, sanctification begins. It's a real change. In other words, God doesn't leave the sinner in that person sins, God begins a work by grace through faith to change the sinner's heart, mind, behavior to start on this journey of holiness, so that the Christian life is really a journey to becoming more and more obedient to Christ, more and more following the commandments, and sanctification, sanctus, holy, becomes more and more holy. So Wesley called this doctrine scriptural holiness, and he said the reason Methodism was raised up was to reform the nation, especially the church, and to spread scriptural holiness across the lands.
Well, I think some in the Lutheran tradition, they draw a sharp line between justification and sanctification. If you think of it on a person's timeline, justification is this, strict one-time event in which a person is justified. Following that, there is a long process of sanctification. I think in the East and West, they refuse to make any distinction. Like in the East, Eastern Orthodoxy, they don't make any distinction between, say, the process of being justified and sanctified. It's all kind of one big bundle. Where does Wesley kind of fall on that? On that, would he regard justification as a point when one is converted, or does it happen at baptism, or is it hard to say, or is it a process?
Well, we believe in infant baptism, and so Wesley tends to talk about some sort of regeneration happening at the point of baptism, even for infants. Okay. But he says most people sin it away. He has this image that salvation is a house. Repentance is the porch. Justification is the doorway. And sanctification is the rest of the house. And so if you're moving into the household of God, your time in the house is all about sanctification. And so justification is, again, a moment. And you move in through the doorway, but you live in the house.
Okay. And last question, for clarification. Meredith talked about perfection being a hypothetical possibility. What was Wesley's worldview on perfection in terms of it being a real possibility versus a hypothetical possibility? Did he believe that a person this side of heaven could become and could be declared morally perfect?
And do we have a list of those people?
Evan, let me be really clear that the definition of terms is pretty important. Wesley never believed somebody could be so perfect as not to commit any sins whatsoever. Perfection is defined as not violating intentionally a known law of God. So human beings are going to make mistakes. They're ignorant. Unintentional things are going to happen, so that we're always sinners in some major sense. But he was also very optimistic about the opportunity that God could so work in your life that all of your intentional actions and thoughts and words are in obedience to the will of God. So that if it's a known law of God and you're measuring it by intentions, you can get to that point. So that for him, it was a real possibility. However, following Jeremy Taylor's Holy Living and Holy Dying, he said, for most people, it happens in the moment of your death. That as you're coming to God, dying, all of a sudden you're cleansed in that way. Now, let's talk about the rest of Methodist history for a minute. In the 19th century, this entire sanctification movement then spread to some people in the Wesleyan movement, broadly speaking, who believed in instantaneous entire sanctification. Phoebe Palmer.
Is that the Keswick thing? Keswick holiness?
Some of the Keswick people are that way. I'm not as familiar with them, Sarah, but to say the entire instantaneous sanctification, there are parts of Wesley's sermons where he talks about if God's powerful and you're willing, God can instantly, completely sanctify you. And so some of the revivalist movements in the mid-1800s emphasized that entire sanctification piece. I'll give you an interesting story. I love Wesley's hymns, Charles Wesley's hymns. And in the hymn, Love Divine, All Loves Excelling, Charles wrote in the second stanza, take away our power of sinning. Now, his hymns were published by his older brother, John. George Whitefield, their friend from Oxford, objected to that language and convinced John to change it. So in our Methodist hymnal today, it says, take away our bent to sinning. Softened it a little bit, but that's what Whitefield talked John into doing to his brother's hymn.
Gotcha.
Interesting.
Well, Aaron.
Okay.
Come back on that. What might a Calvinist say to all this?
Well, I'd say first off, there's a great amount that you said, Scott, that I fully agree with, and I think the emphasis upon verse 10 in Ephesians 2 is one that's often overlooked. And understanding that, people like to talk about, well, I just got saved. When did you get saved? And not understanding soteriology and the complete process of it, and understanding even, God's intentional purpose and work in sanctification. There are some things that, in regard to sanctification, and so I'm going to deal with some of it's going to be my understanding of perfectionism. So I may be interacting to a certain degree with things that you're not affirming right now, or you haven't stated you hold to. And so it's my, best way of working with what I've read and what I understand with my limited understanding of Wesleyan theology. But there's things that I do find concerning about it. And I think the first thing I think that's really important to understand is rightly understanding the moral law of God. And anytime that man begins to get into, stratifying the moral law of God, creating different levels of, significance in that, I think we're walking on dangerous grounds. They asked Jesus, "What's the greatest commandment?" They were hoping he would pick one of the 10. Is he going to pick the fifth one? Is he going to pick the 10th one? And he instead gave them 2. And he said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself." And he said, that's the understanding there is that he's summarizing the moral law of God. That is the expectation. Anything that we do that doesn't hit that is sin. And so as a Reformed Baptist, how I approach something like this and understand it is going to be in the category of the fourfold state of man. And if you look in the London Baptist Confession of Faith, the Second London Baptist Confession, in the 9th chapter, we have a chapter on free will, believe it or not. Calvinists have a chapter in their confession on free will. And, you could say, well, does man have free will? The question is, well, what do you mean by free? What do you mean by will? And so we understand that Adam in the garden was made innocent. He was made righteous. He was made perfect. He could sin. He could not sin. Adam fell, and all of us fell in him. And all who came from Adam fell into sin. And so he then fell into humanity's in a state of sin at that point. And so the work of God needs to happen upon the person. Regeneration needs to occur. And at that place, we're in a position where we can sin or we can not sin. We have the option of doing either one. And glorification is what ultimately happens. And when I hear some of the perfectionist ideas coming forward, to me, it sounds like an over-realized eschatology and an over-realized soteriology.
Can you define those words real quick?
Sure.
There might have people listening that are
Absolutely.
like, I don't know what this is.
So this may happen a few times in this conversation, but so eschatology, that's our understanding of what is going to happen in the future, all right? And so just as an example, some word of faith teachers may tell you things like, well, you can be healed right now. You can live a life and never be sick. And usually there's some things that you have to do that. I would say that's an overrealized eschatology. We have a promise that we will never be sick in the future. In glory, we'll have a new body. But, part of that hope in the future is that we are going to be resurrected. We're going to be placed in the New Jerusalem. There's going to be a wall around to protect us. There will be no invasion from Satan as there was in the garden. And so we will no longer be living in sinful flesh. And so we will not have, the issues that we have now. And that's my concern here, is that I feel like it's an over-realized eschatology. And when we start getting into the high theoretical ideas and we say things like, well, isn't it possible? Is it possible? There's a great many things that we could theoretically say are possible that aren't really helpful to us and could actually be a distraction from what we're doing. Like I could say, well, it's possible for, to flip a quarter 1,000,000 times in a row and it to land on heads 1,000,000 times. Well, you could make that argument mathematically, philosophically. It's possible. That's not reality. That's not going to happen. And so that's not something that we need to be doing something with. The other issue that I have is that there is, and I think we noticed that as the introduction was given, is that there's a diminishment of the moral law of God. And so one of my other concerns is that this leads to antinomianism.
You're definitely going to have to define that one.
That's fine.
Okay.
So antinomianism, nomos, the Greek word for law, just means without law. And so it doesn't literally, someone who's antinomian, it doesn't mean that you have no law of your own. Legalism and antinomianism are kind of bedfellows. They very much work together. And so there is going to be a diminishment of the moral law. And so there's going to be a statement that you're meeting the moral law in some way that does not actually meet it. And so that leads to man saying, this is the moral law of God. I get to determine what the moral law of God. I get to determine what keeping the moral law of God is. This is exactly what Jesus was dealing with the Pharisees. They were taking the moral law of God. They were lowering it to their own standard and then declaring someone to keep it. And so I know this is very much in the theoretical. You're not going to find anyone that says this guy was perfect. We're definitely not looking through the pages of Scripture and pointing to any of them and saying, well, this one was perfect. That's
there was one guy. Yeah.
Yes, Jesus.
Yeah.
I am Orthodox.
He's kind of the exception here, Sarah.
Yes,
I know.
yes,
I'm just giving the Sunday school answer when I can.
Okay.
Yeah.
But that's one of the beauties of Christianity is that, the grace of God is shown in the sinfulness of man. And that, the Bible doesn't whitewash the people that are there, and even the heroes of the Bible that we make VeggieTales stories about. They needed the grace of God as well. And so, that's kind of my concern there is antinomianism, and this doesn't really help the Christian. This isn't how sanctification works. Sanctification is something that is continual. It's over time. It is something where God is working and chipping away at you. And the reality is we don't even know many times the ways in which we are sinning. We have to be informed later on to even come to that understanding. And that even is part of the sanctification process.
Yeah. I will say I have met people who claimed the ability to be perfect and even claimed perfection.
Yeah.
So,
Really?
yeah.
Wow.
I mean, they weren't.
Like for more than 5 minutes, or?
I mean, like when I do college outreach, I've had lunches and things like that, and like students would come, and they're more from like charismatic. Now they weren't like members of United Methodist Church that I'm aware of. It was more charismatic Pentecostal background, but they really believed that, in a way that I'm sure that Bishop Jones would highly object to. But they believed essentially that becoming Christian was, I think you had kind of mentioned some of those other groups. There's kind of an immediate perfection. But that said, let me just clarify one thing, and then maybe have kind of a dialogue. Is what you're saying that so long as perfection remains even a possibility, that man is going to want to attain it, given that it's, on your view, unattainable, the only way to get there would be to lower the law of God to his standard. In other words, he's not going to be able to, you would say, anthropologically speaking, be raised up to the level of God's holiness or perfection. So therefore, the only option is going to be an inevitable downgrade of God's law to an attainable level.
So let me do my best to give the Reformed Baptist perspective on this. It is our view that when you become a Christian, justification happens immediately. That's a positional change legally between you and God. Sanctification happens immediately. Believe there is an immediate sanctification, an immediate change of that person. They've gone from being spiritually dead to being spiritually alive. We believe there is a progressive sanctification. And it is at that point when someone is a Christian and the Spirit of God is dwelling within them that that person has the ability to keep the moral law of God. So make sure you understand that I am communicating that, that prior to conversion, you have done nothing but sin the entirety of your life because you have not kept those 2 commandments that Jesus gave, which are a summary of the moral law. And when you become converted, that's the first time in your existence you are able to actually keep the moral law of God. So I'm not diminishing this and saying that man can't keep the law of God. As a Christian, absolutely. The Word of God and the Spirit of God work within you and change you, and you can keep the moral law of God. It's a whole other thing to then go on and say that someone is going to do that the entirety of their life when you understand the reality of their existence in sinful flesh, dealing with the old man and the existence of the world around them. So the world, the flesh, and the devil are something that Christians are dealing with. And so I don't like to dwell into this, well, it's possible theoretically. I mean, there's a lot of things where we can get into dealing with, well, this might be possible. No, I don't, it's not realistic. And so I want to understand, I have a very high view of sanctification in that I believe that God changes a person whereby they keep the moral law of God. But to say that the person would do that the totality of their existence when they're still in the process of being sanctified, I think is going to require to diminish the moral law of God in some way, to lower it.
Yeah.
I have a question for each of you. I'm going to save the one for Bishop Jones till a little bit later because I think it'll distract from right now, but I'm curious. But for you, Aaron, I'm curious how you respond to the Matthew passage that he read. I had a Mennonite one time say, why would Jesus command us to do something that we couldn't do?
Oh, so we're going back to the Augustine Pelagian controversy, right?
Perhaps. You tell me.
Well, where Augustine prayed that God would give him the ability to do what he commanded. And that was quite offensive to Pelagius. This idea that if God's commanding you to do something, you have the ability to do it. And so, well, first we have to go back and understand what I already laid out in regard to the fourfold state of man, that Adam had the ability to keep the law of God. These commands that come from God do not change because man became sinful. God is who God is. God is immutable. He doesn't change. He's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And so man changed. God didn't change. God's commands remained.
Right.
And so man is the one who has fallen short of the glory of God. Man is the one who is not keeping that standard. And so God is going to command that which you can't do, and it's not his fault that you can't do it. But we must recognize that God showed his love to us while we were yet sinners. Christ died. So God has made a way whereby, all right, you can be saved, you can have a right relationship with him, and you can be obedient to these commandments.
So you're saying this commandment is one that he gave. God doesn't change, but because of our state, we're not able to do this. Then why did Jesus ask us to do it? It seems like a waste of breath or just a way for us to feel crappy all the time because we're not ever gonna.
Okay, so feeling crappy might be a good idea sometimes, right?
True.
So let's be honest.
Isn't that the front door of the house?
If you I'm gonna get sound bitten on that one. This is live, but okay, so. It's not a bad thing that you would mourn or feel bad over your sin. That's one of the purposes of the law is to. That's our understanding as Reformed Baptists, is that one of the purposes of the law that we have is to show your need of a Savior.
Sure.
And so God is declaring that. It's kind of like, let's say you go to the doctor and you get a diagnosis and you have cancer. Well, it's not going to make you feel good that the doctor told you that you had cancer.
Right.
That's not the purpose of the doctor's declaration. That's not the purpose of, him, the prognosis there. The purpose of it is to make you aware of your problem. And the solution is not found in just wallowing in what you are not, but to recognize the free gift that God has given in Jesus Christ that you can access by grace and through faith.
Yeah.
And so God, throughout the Bible, gives people commands. He tells the Israelites, be holy as I am holy. He tells us, be holy as I am holy. And so therefore, you must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Jesus here in the Sermon on the Mount is unpacking the moral law of God. And so he's teaching here that you should love your neighbor as yourself. He's teaching here, he's unpacking, honestly, the sixth commandment, the positive understanding, don't murder. Well, then I should be loving of other people. I should be a protector of life. And so I should treat people the way that I want to be treated. What's my problem? I don't do that. I don't keep the law of God. I don't rightly love other people. What happens is that I'm falling short here. God hasn't changed. He still has this commandment. The good news here is that Jesus has done this. Jesus kept the moral law in every respect in his active obedience, and we are granted the benefits of what he has done by grace and through faith.
I want to make sure Dr. Jones can come in because I want to make sure we're not.
I am not trying to.
No.
I'm asking questions. So I'm not.
Just because I don't want him being painted as an antinomian if in fact he is not an antinomian.
I do want to be clear on that I'm not accusing him. I'm not accusing you of any of that. I'm trying to interact with this the best that I can, and so I may not only be interacting with the things that you say.
No.
So
sure.
Well, actually, Wesley is deeply concerned with antinomianism and wants to say the law is established by faith. We have got to take the moral law seriously, uphold it. That's what holiness is all about, is to increase obedience to the law. I think, Aaron, if I were to critique the dangers of a Wesleyan position, the biggest danger is works righteousness. That instead of focusing on grace, doing this work in us, that we tend to think it's all by human striving. That's why I call attention to that Ephesians 2 section. Faith, there is a human part of co-creating, cooperating with God's grace. God doesn't force us to become holy. God offers us the power to become holy by grace. And yet, sometimes we human beings, and I think it may be an especially American phenomenon, we tend to say, look at what I've done. Look at how good I am. So the dangers of antinomianism and works righteousness are both sort of rocks that you got to sail your ship through in between.
Yeah. And that's not easy, to be clear. I mean, like the distinguishing between law and gospel, these are difficult things to do, and every, I think, preacher should be challenged, with the notion that we're telling Christians pursue holiness, and yet at the same time you know.
Well, Evan, let's sort of come back at the Lutherans in this deal. I think Luther was working in a context where works righteousness and earning your salvation was endemic to the funding of St. Peter's Cathedral, and you've got this overreaction on the part of Luther to say simul justus et peccator, and you downplay sanctification, so Wesley thought. And so you have to guard in your theology, what are the biggest heresies that are working in the culture today and the biggest threats to the proclamation of a holistic gospel that is, Luther at his best and Wesley at his best.
Yeah.
Calvin at his best. Aaron, I have to say, Wesley said Methodist doctrine is a hair's breadth away from Calvinism. So most of what you said, I completely agree with.
Yeah. And coming from like a liberal denomination where the gospel became, in fact, it's one of my pet peeves. We say the word gospel, and that can mean different things to different people. The way that you just used it is the totality of the message of Christ, sort of law and gospel or the whole counsel of God. But it's often used as it's just the good news. And the only thing the church is ever about in our modern age is just this good news. We've taken the necessary corrective of 1530 or whatever, 1517 of justification by grace, and then now everything is just grace. So basically it's all permissiveness. So I think we all would agree that the law of God says No.
Well, actually, Evan, I'm currently writing a book on grace because Methodists today, United Methodists, tend not to talk about convincing grace. The kind of grace that convinces you of your sin, that in fact, like the diagnosis that Aaron just mentioned, part of God's grace is telling you, you've got issues and you've fallen short and you need a Savior.
Yeah.
Sounds irresistible. Wink.
So was there anything in what Aaron said that you would take issue with in terms of, I don't know, either man's capacity or, or a downgrade of the moral law of God or anything like that? I mean, do you don't...
He was naming dangers that are very real. I mean, people do downgrade the moral law of God. They don't really want to be, they don't want to read the Sermon on the Mount and take it seriously. And so that's all accurate. I tend to say that I would talk more of an optimistic approach of what God can do in people's lives, and that some sort of growth is possible. Going back to that Matthew 5:48 text, the word perfect here is teloi, which really is translated in Philippians and other places as mature. So lately I've been preaching all over my area, and one of the ways I start my sermon is, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I'm not talking career. I'm talking, what kind of person do you want to have become? What's the goal of the Christian life? And that's where describing the moral law of God or the 9 fruit of the Spirit or other characteristics becomes a vehicle for portraying to the Christian, here's a life goal that God can work in you if you'll just use God's grace to get there.
I like that.
Aaron, was there anything that he said in his opening remarks that you, kind of would want to address directly, maybe?
Yeah. Something does come to mind with what he just said here, and it does tie into the opening remarks. I do feel that the Calvinistic position is kind of being communicated as something that is more pessimistic. Like if only we were more optimistic and we were just saying, well, God could do this. There's no real question in my mind of what God can do. God can turn rocks into his children if he wants to. He's so omnipotent that which exists not, responds to his beck and call. He commands light to come into existence. It's obedient to him, though it's not even in existence. So I have no question in regard to what God can do, what God has the ability to do. There's no question there. I'm pushing more on the issue of how sanctification actually works. And within any decent Reformed church, you're going to have a continual pressing of people to apply that which is being proclaimed and to understand that one of the uses of the law, going back to, an understanding of the uses of the law. We have 3 uses of the law that we understand as Reformed people. And so one of them is as a way in which the Christian should live. And so we understand God has given these laws to us, not to make our lives boring, not to make our lives difficult, but because this is the best way in which we should live. This is the way in which he's commanded us to live. And so, I mean, that's absolutely something that we hold to as Reformed Baptists is that God's called us to live this way. We should live this way. The fact that I'm not interacting with the perfectionist notion doesn't diminish at all the chasm that exists between where we were, like Lazarus, dead in his tomb, decomposing, and where he is now alive and walking around at a party with his friends. And that's the picture of us as Christians. Like you can look at, like you can say, oh, but we're not going to be perfect. Well, you will be perfect one day. That is a promise, absolutely. But you can look at where you were, dead in your trespasses and sins, a child of the devil, and here you are adopted into the kingdom of God, a child of God. And the aspect that I'd want to interact with in far as antinomianism is that my perspective is that what you did say was antinomian. And because you began to talk about someone who could keep the moral law of God and only talking about what they intentionally did, that's not keeping the law of God. That's not perfection. That's a long shot from perfection, because it's not taking into account, first off, all the ignorance that you have,
which you mentioned, yeah.
Yeah, because the reality is, that there's ways in which we're sinning that we don't realize. And part of the sanctification process is our mind being renewed and us coming to a richer and greater understanding of the moral law of God, which, by the way, is what Jesus was doing in the Sermon on the Mount. He was unpacking the moral law of God. Men had their understanding of what it was, and he was communicating to them that God is looking at the very heart. And so there's ways in which we're sinning. I mean, even on the theoretical idea that someone could do this and meet this standard, this is man's standard. It's still sin. So even this theoretical idea of someone that could come to a place where they're no longer committing any willful sins, again, we're still kind of in this theoretical idea. We're not in reality. I don't know anyone you've met some people that stand before you and say that they've reached that, but I haven't met anyone. And I doubt someone like that would want to stand and do a debate on something like that. But the reality is that is so far below what God requires that you couldn't call it perfection, because it's not meeting God's law. You look at Nadab and Abihu. You look at the man who touched the ark as it was falling off of the cart. He intended well. All of our good intentions are irrelevant in that point. He meant well by keeping the ark from falling into the mud, but the fact is that he violated the law of God, and he was judged at that point for violating the law of God, not for his best intentions.
Okay, come back to that, because you mentioned that earlier in this, when Wesley talked about perfection. He talked about a person, kind of their outward works all being as they should be, I guess, all being appropriate, all being lawful. And that was...
No, Wesley said perfection does not include all of one's outward works being lawful because of ignorance, unintentional consequences. Okay. And in fact, given the 21st century, we live in social situations where I am participating in the destruction of the environment. I don't have any options to care for God's creation without being sinful in that way. And so when you look at social sins, I'm guilty of some things that I don't have any way of not doing. And so there are exceptions. Nevertheless, when we talk about cleansing our hearts so that all of our intentions and behaviors outwardly that are intentional, we're not engaging in willful sin. And that's the kind of cleansing that I think is possible and worthy of talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So would you say this distinction between like willful sin and it seems like the distinction or the divide is a little bit between this concept that, well, we commit willful sins where we think about a sin and when we set about to do it. But then there's like this nature of sin, that is so deep and profound that you really can't make a distinction between those things. So it's almost like saying, well, basically you're okay unless you commit a willful sin, but the Calvinist is more saying, I guess because they're pessimists. No, I kid. I know that's not accurate. But, it's like, no, there's not even you can't even find But
let me just interrupt and say, when you said, well, you're okay, isn't that what justification is all about? You are okay. You're an adopted son or daughter of God. You're okay. We're talking about how far is it possible that God could bring you?
My question would be maybe a little bit more practical, because we keep using the word sanctification. So I wonder if you guys would even define that differently and or how does it work? I mean, in my understanding, sanctification is just the process of being made more holy. But how does that work? Or is it making better choices? Is it showing more fruit? And who's doing that? Is that God? Is that you? I know you would say it's a participation, and you probably would too, but maybe just explaining how sanctification works from your perspective might be helpful.
I'll give you an example.
Okay.
My daughter was 12 years old.
Yeah.
She had done something that deserved correction. But because I was dealing with a really tough couple of weeks, I blew up at her. She stepped back in fear because I was out of control. I was yelling, I was ranting, I was raging, I was angry. And I realized when she stepped back afraid of her father, Scott, you've got a problem. That violates one of the fruit of the Spirit. I was not patient. I was not kind. I was in a small group for accountability, and I confessed my sin to my colleagues. And over the years, God has worked on me, and I'm a much more patient and kind person now than I used to be. So that part of my spiritual life, God has changed my heart. I'm better than I used to be in any objective analysis. Now, I've still got other issues, but on the patience
piece... Why don't you list them out for our listeners, But
on the patience side of things, that's part of what I've prayed for over the years. God, heal my heart, help me be more patient.
And just to dig in a little bit, because, and maybe I'm getting too practical, but after you confessed to your accountability group and you were praying for that, I'm sure then there were moments where you had little miniature choices to make, right? You feel something start to flare up and because the Holy Spirit is empowering you, you can kind of say no to your fleshly desire maybe to blow up again, right? There are little choices along the way as you're being perfected by God.
When Paul in Philippians 2 says, work out your own salvation because God is at work in you, I think that part of what God is doing through the Holy Spirit is restoring to us the capacity to say yes to God's grace on a day-to-day basis. That, in fact, we make progress in the Christian life because God's grace is empowering us and we allow God to shape that. And some of those are nudges where, God pushes us to do things that we wouldn't normally do. And sometimes God sends us people. One of the stories I tell is the time I was waiting to go into the sanctuary when I was a professor, and this saintly woman in front of me named Sue said, "What are you doing Wednesday night?" I said, "Why do you ask?" She said, "Well, our food pantry needs staff Wednesday night. I wondered if you were free." I would much prefer to have written her a check. But instead she asked me for my time. And because I admired her, because we were in the same church together, because I'd read Matthew 25 about feeding the hungry, I said yes. And that's the kind of, God's at work sanctifying me and giving me an opportunity right in front of me. And I did.
I'm curious your answer to the question of what is sanctification? How does it work?
How does sanctification work? Okay. So I've already made a distinction between two types of sanctification, immediate. And so you have many passages that talk about immediate, and you have a progressive sanctification.
When you say immediate sanctification, are you saying the same thing that we're using in the word justification? What is immediate sanctification?
Sure. So justification is a changing of your legal standing with God. And so God no longer is seeing you in your sin. He's seeing you through the righteous lens of Christ Jesus. So from a legal, Romans 5, that from a legal standpoint, that is where the Lord is seeing you. He's not holding your sin against you. That said, you are still someone who needs to be sanctified. Immediate sanctification happens in that you're regenerated and there's an immediate change that happens in you. So justification is your legal standing. Sanctification is talking about where you actually are as a person. And so there's a great difference between someone who is, it can be different for different people. I have a 12-year-old daughter that was baptized recently. And so, as I talked to her and walked through her conversion and talked about her testimony, she doesn't have this, testimony like she was in a biker gang and selling drugs and all of that. But
of. I'm joking.
Right. But the reality is that others may have something more drastic, and so others it's going to be more clear. But that immediate thing would be something that was very clear. The guy says, "I need to stop being in this biker gang and selling drugs," and he turns away from that. And so you have this kind of immediate. Well, there's that man may still does have other things that need to be changed in his life.
Right.
And that's the progressive aspect of it. So how does progressive sanctification happen? That's your question.
Yes.
Okay. So we would understand this as working through the Word and the Spirit and through ordinary means of grace. And so the Lord is working within his people through ordinary means of grace as they're gathering on the Lord's Day, sitting under the preaching, reading the Word, praying, participating in the Lord's Supper, even baptism. We're understanding these ideas as molding, changing the people as they are there. Additionally, Christians edifying one another, being in one another's life, the work of the Spirit, and even just life situations. The Lord is doing. That's why, and I'm glad you're not in the perfectionist camp that is like this. If you just had this right belief right now, then it would all just be here. Because that's almost like how some of the word faith will fall into in their overrealized eschatology of, you'd just be healed right now if you just believe this right. Well, this is kind of in soteriology. You'd just be sanctified if you just believe this right here. And the reality of how this works out is in time, in your life. And the truth is, it's not a simple thing. The Lord is working with you in times of stress, difficulty, pain, disappointment, in all of these things that the Lord is using. That's the promise we have, that even these difficult, painful things, terrible things, God will use those for our good. And one of the good things that comes out of the pressure of life and difficulty that is here is the Lord sanctifying us and working in us in those circumstances and in those situations that we would be changed during those times. I mean, you see that with Peter, the man. At one point, I talked about this on my sermon last Sunday, that, the Lord had worked in his life. And you see Peter being changed and sanctified. And you see Peter at one point denying Christ outside the court. You see him then inside the court proclaiming Christ quite boldly. And so that is a snippet of how sanctification happens.
Was Wesley's message, to kind of tie it back to the historical era, and what he was encountering as he preached and what maybe frustrated him in the life of the church, did he see a need for the church to be, simply bolder in calling Christians to live like Christians, and that's why he, speaks about this particular doctrine, or he calls for holiness of living, is because what was he finding out there? What was he finding among people who profess Christ?
I think there were two things that he found. One were people who were antinomian, who were living in ways that violated God's laws and never even acknowledged that they were falling short. And secondly, there were people who were focused on too much of the law and not grace, and didn't really understand how the sinner's submission to God's grace was essential, that they had to be born again, that they had to experience this. And so it was both sides of this tension that I talked about as the extreme center, where, people were not really living the whole gospel at that point. And quite frankly, the Church of England was not adapting to the population moves of the early Industrial Revolution. And so you had all these people who were outside of the church completely. And so part of what he did was to start preaching out in the fields to reach people who were living on the edges of town when the Church of England wasn't starting new congregations.
Yeah. I will say I do want to find some points of commonality and maybe tie a thread of this whole series together, which is that, all of these reformers are, I think, trying to bring about a living and active and true faith in Jesus Christ. And to do that, they have to pull people out of this institutional safety, because people had just been part of the church and they really hadn't been taught very much, and sermons for hundreds of years were little ditties that really didn't teach much other than about Roman Catholic saints or something like that. And all of these men are kind of saying, no, this is what actually being a Christian looks like. And it was opening the eyes of people, and it took a long time to get there, so I think that's a good thing. And actually, I hear a lot of agreement with y'all. I don't think either one of y'all actually thinks little of the law of God, quite the contrary. And to one question for Aaron might be something like, if perfection isn't our goal, or if perfection isn't our standard, what other standard do we have to appeal to? I mean, are we basically, should we say, well,
aim for a 7 out of 10. yeah.
Exactly. So I'm picking on you a little bit.
Right. Yeah. And it's not about me. I'm setting a standard. God set the standard. So the standard's 10 out of 10. Perfection is the requirement. But we recognize as Christians, we are not making that mark. We needed the active righteousness of Jesus to grant us eternal life. And, if it was possible for us to keep the moral law completely, then Jesus' active righteousness wouldn't have been necessary. And so there is a reminder for us there that we need the grace of God, and we need his active righteousness and the fruit that bore in our lives. But it's not about me just theoretically saying, yeah, but I could do this. The reality of my day in my life is to exist in my family and with my congregation and with other people. And the reality is that God is sanctifying me there to bring to mind the various ways in which I am falling short of the law of God, bringing to mind things that I didn't even realize and calling me to repent of those things. And
but that's that you can pursue holiness.
But that's what that is. That's what sanctification. I mean, that when I'm talking about the law of God, we're talking about holiness.
Right.
That's the righteous standard. And so it's not a ho-hum, I'll never make it. It's because, I mean, if I were to say something like, well, if perfection isn't possible, what's the point? Like, that would be very ungrateful for me to look at the greatness of the grace that God has given to me and the blessings that have been given there for me to consider where I was in the deadness of my sin and where I am now. I mean, sanctification is the pursuit of holiness. And I mean, if you're reformed, that should be something that's being communicated, is that you are, that is one of the ways in which the law of God is used. It is the way in which Christians should be living. You are to pursue holiness. That's exactly what you're commanded to do. And you have that ability because of what Christ has done on your behalf.
Yeah. But
go ahead.
Well, so is the concern then it's so we all agree we should be pursuing holiness, which is essentially pursuing perfection because God is perfectly good.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Is the concern then that a person might essentially place themselves before Christ, in front of Christ, in being the vehicle, able by which to attain perfection? So the Reformed are saying Christ gives you perfection. Yeah. Your concern is then that if other people, Wesleyans or charismatics or anyone else in very different ways, if they say that perfection is possible, they could be actually subverting the work of Christ or getting in front of it. We know that, that's not what's being said here, but, would that be the concern?
Sometimes, the deficiencies in a particular theology don't manifest themselves in the current generation, but manifest themselves in generations to come forward. And so if we're telling people that they can reach a state of perfection, and in that we're communicating a diminished view of the law of God that is not the law of God at all, you're telling people that you can actually do this. So yes, I do think that someone in the future could come to an understanding and could actually believe that they are actually reaching the law of God and thereby attaining that righteous standing themselves and would not be in need of the active righteousness of Jesus. I do think that that's a possibility. And so that's an area where this could tiptoe near a heresy, and you end up right back into Roman Catholic theology, back into the idea where this is me and I'm doing this, and now we're conflating justification and sanctification.
Well, that actually segues into the question that I said I had earlier for Bishop Jones, and I hope we can tag this on and it doesn't get us too far afield from the question, but I love the analogy of the house. Remember what the patio is, the front porch?
Repentance.
Well, repentance was the front door, I thought. You walk through repentance.
No, repentance is the porch.
Justification is the front door.
Justification is the door.
And then the house is sanctification. And so my question for you is, can someone walk out of the house and walk away from sanctification? And can they walk away from being justified?
Now we're into, once saved, always saved kind of stuff. I promise not to stay there
very long, but this is maybe my biggest sort of like beef with with Wesleyan theology, or maybe it's just fear, right? I'm like, please don't let me walk out of the house, you know?
Well, I see sanctification as a lifelong process. We are never free from sin.
Sure.
Because of mistakes and temptations and unintended consequences, all those things. We're always sinners in some absolute sense of falling short of God's will for our life.
Right.
But also it's possible to make the choices that leave you to go out of the house. You make shipwreck of the faith, as Paul says, and you find yourself saying, I once knew Christ and I'm just through with that life. And so, yes, I think you can walk back out the door and lose your salvation.
Well, let's end on that note. It's nice and cheery. I'm joking.
Well, was there anything that Aaron said?
We called this guy a pessimist, but that,
Was there anything that Aaron said that you wanted to respond to in terms of, I mean, I know that you would not say that man is in any way competing with Christ for his salvation. So if I said anything that hinted at that, well, we know that's not the case. There are people who, I mean, I would argue that Roman Catholicism technically does make that case. But maybe that's a whole other can of worms. But is the Methodist position simply that a Christian ought to live as holy as he possibly can?
Well, yes, by grace through faith. That in fact, what God's doing is convincing you of your sin, calling you into justification, and then sanctifying you by the means of grace over the rest of your life. And the goal is holiness, to be as holy as you possibly can be. So that holiness is a life goal to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself, and exhibit the fruits of the Spirit, and care for the poor, all those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. I think what I resonate with in what Aaron said is, we live in a day and time when people want to either diminish the law of God by not paying attention to all the commandments, or the moral commandments, that is, or they want the kind of cheap grace. Mm-hmm. One of my friends had a father who was a doctor, started an affair with his nurse, left his wife and family, and said, well, that's okay. I can get forgiveness from God. Mm. You sort of justify your willful disobedience with a kind of cheap grace that's not really the gospel.
Yeah. I mean, I do think we live in an interesting era that is so far removed from Luther and Wesley and Calvin, in the sense that they all did have such a high regard for the law of God. But even our fight among Christians, even among proclaimed Christians in all of our church bodies, is maybe the Reformed Baptists have avoided, but the Lutherans and the Methodists haven't, and the Presbyterians. It's just such monumental differences in understanding the moral law of God. So,
I think, Evan, the other part of following the law of God is, how do you apply it given our understanding of the complexities of society today? Is it immoral for a Christian to own a gas-guzzling SUV, given what's going on with the environment? What's our complicity with racism and the heritage of slavery in America? What about British and colonial powers in Africa? I mean, you're caught up in social systems that make God angry and contribute to human degradation. And so how do you apply? I mean, it's the old alcohol issue for Methodists. Is it okay for Christians to drink alcohol? We still use grape juice for our communion services. I tell them it's unfermented wine, and Mr. Welch was a Methodist preacher who invented grape juice to keep us away from alcohol. How you apply the moral law of God to different circumstances is a part of the difficulty in our churches that you're referring to.
No, 100% it is difficult, and it's one of the things I find most difficult about preaching is, applying the law and doing so rightly without becoming a legalist, so. But we're just about out of time. I know both of our gentlemen here have other appointments today. Either one of y'all have any kind of closing thoughts or anything that wasn't said as we wrap up here? Or did you get it all out?
No mic drop moments,
No, I appreciate the opportunity to come to speak and, just to walk through this and talk through this, and appreciate everyone's time and this opportunity.
I'm glad to learn more about the Reformed Baptist approach and the confession of faith you mentioned from the 17th century. I need to go read. I need to pay some attention to it.
Yeah, the combination of the Reformed and the Baptist is interesting. But I knew he'd be a strong 5-point Calvinist, so represent.
I've got a copy of it here. You can have it if you want.
Oh, there you go! Wow, look at there.
That's an evangelistic move, isn't it?
Yeah. You'll be a 1689er before you know it. Watch out. You're going to enter your cage stage of Calvinism by early
next time he comes on the podcast, he'll be like,
exactly.
arguing for Reformed theology.
Yeah.
A bishop in a cage stage with 1,000 churches under him. That would be
man. That would be
quite a cage.
Boy, that
stage.
would be trouble. That would be trouble. But Aaron, people can find you at Grace Family Baptist Church up on the north side of Houston. Website
www.gracefamilybaptist.net.
Cool. Good deal. And by the time this airs, it'll be into December, so you'll be very close to retirement. I'm sure having retirement parties thrown and everything already. So I'm not sure where people find you.
Extremecenter.org.
Oh, okay.
Oh, perfect.
Very cool. But to tie everything back together to your opening remarks, Extremecenter.org. Is that your website?
Yes. Personal website.
Oh, excellent.
Oh, very cool.
Well,
I wrote the book United Methodist Doctrine with the subtitle Extreme Center.
Oh, okay.
So It's been my tag for a while.
Good deal. Well, glad we got that out. You can find Sarah on Facebook, Sarah Garment Stone, and at Memorial Drive Presbyterian Church, and at HoustonTOT.com.
Mm-hmm. All of the bios for all the leaders, including where we stand on some of this kind of stuff, is on the leadership page of HoustonTOT.com, including pictures, and so you can learn a little bit more about us if you want to haze us or come and fight against what we believe or whatever. Yeah.
Well, good deal. And I'm Evan McClanahan at First Lutheran here in Midtown Houston, flhouston.org. Check us out. But we want to thank you all for listening. Thanks to listening to this whole series. Mm-hmm. And until next time, we encourage you to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.